Imagine, for a moment, that you awaken as the ruler of a shattered world. The catastrophe has already passed. Cities lie buried beneath layers of hardened earth, streets drowned in mud, rooftops crushed under centuries of silence. Your banners now fly where others once ruled. In your hands rests absolute authority, printing presses that define truth, universities that teach obedience as knowledge, armies that enforce memory, and scholars who decide what is called science and what is condemned as heresy. You are expected to rebuild. But as your work is digged through collapsed foundations and forgotten basements, something begins to go terribly wrong. They do not uncover primitive tools or crude remnants of a struggling past. Instead, they pull out objects that should not exist. Perfectly machined metal parts. Glass so clear it bends light with precision. Devices that quietly generate electrical current without flame, wire, or motion. Instruments that suggest planning, standardization, and engineering far beyond what your historians claim ever existed before you. These discoveries are more dangerous than rebellion. A rebellion can be crushed. Ideas can be censored. But evidence buried in stone is stubborn. It does not care about ideology. It does not bow to authority. And these artifacts tell a single, devastating story. The past was not primitive. The past was advanced. Possibly more advanced than the world you now rule. This leaves you with a choice. You may admit that humanity has declined, that you inherited the ruins of giants, and that you do not truly understand the systems you now occupy. Or you may do something far more practical. You may rewrite history. You may declare that the strange devices were ritual objects. That precision machines were symbols. That technologies were accidents, myths, or fantasies. You may fragment a once unified world into isolated cultures, separated by centuries, so that no one notices the repeating patterns. You may teach generations that progress flows only forward, never backward, and that anything contradicting this belief must be coincidence. History, after all, belongs to those who write it. Let us now step away from imagination and look at what was actually found. In the year 1936, during excavations near modern-day Baghdad, a German archaeologist uncovered a small clay vessel, roughly 15 centimeters tall. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable. But inside the pot was a copper cylinder, and within that, an iron rod. When researchers poured vinegar or fermented wine into the container, something unexpected occurred. The vessel produced a steady electric current. Not a spark. Not a chemical reaction for decoration. A measurable, stable current of approximately 1 volt. This object would later become known as the Baghdad Battery. Official explanations arrived swiftly. According to academic consensus, the device was a simple tool used by ancient craftsmen for electroplating jewelry. The idea was comforting. It suggested ingenuity without threatening the broader narrative. Ancient people, the story went, accidentally discovered a weak electrical effect and used it to coat ornaments with thin layers of precious metal. At first, this explanation sounds reasonable. Until one begins to calculate. Electroplating is not magic. It requires consistent voltage, stable current, and scale. 1 volt is insufficient for serious work. To create an effective electrolytic bath, multiple power sources must be connected in series. At least several dozen would be required to achieve usable voltage. Now imagine a royal palace. In a single ceremonial hall, there were dozens of large gilded statues, doors, columns, decorative panels, and furniture elements. Conservatively, 20 large objects per hall. Each requiring extended plating time. Each demanding stable power. To plate a single hall, hundreds of batteries would be necessary. To plate an entire palace, thousands. To maintain multiple palaces, tens of thousands. This implies constant production. Warehouses filled with clay vessels. Supplies of copper and iron. Workshops assembling components. Logistics networks delivering materials. Skilled technicians overseeing the process. An entire industrial sector dedicated solely to producing electrical elements. And yet, this is only the beginning of the problem. These vessels were not found in jewelry workshops. They were discovered embedded inside walls. Sealed within foundations. Buried beneath floors. Extracted from underground structures in locations no craftsman would ever use as a workplace. Some were positioned several meters above ground level, others deeply below public buildings. They were placed deliberately. As if they were not tools, but components. Not accessories, but parts of something larger. A system integrated into the architecture itself. Why would one wall off a battery inside a stone structure? Why hide power sources where they cannot be accessed, repaired, or replaced easily. Unless they were never meant to be handled by individuals at all. Unless they were elements of a distributed network, embedded during construction, intended to function as long-term infrastructure. In an era when copper was smelted in simple furnaces and iron was considered precious, someone was designing electrical systems. This raises another question. How does one transmit electricity without visible wires? Why integrate energy sources directly into masonry? These questions transformed the Baghdad battery from a curiosity into something far more unsettling: evidence. Evidence that the technological history we are taught may be incomplete, or deliberately simplified. And the deeper researchers dig beneath the ruins of ancient cities, the harder it becomes to maintain the official story. Because the batteries were not alone. Beneath layers of collapsed stone and hardened earth, archaeologists uncovered networks of ceramic pipes laid with astonishing precision. These pipes were sealed using resin-based compounds so effective that even modern plumbers would struggle to replicate the results. Water flowed through them under pressure without leaking into the surrounding soil. This was not a simple drainage ditch. It was a fully engineered sewage system. The diameters of the pipes were calculated to maintain optimal pressure. The angles of bends were carefully chosen to minimize loss. The slopes ensured gravity-assisted flow. In certain areas, remains of mechanisms resembling pumps or water elevators suggested forced circulation. Such systems are capable of serving cities with populations in the hundreds of thousands. Open any standard history textbook and you will be told that complex sewage systems were a Roman invention. That before them, waste was discarded into streets or open channels. That pressurized underground sanitation only truly emerged in the 19th century, when industrial materials, hydraulic science, and public health crises forced European capitals to act. Yet here it was. Fully formed. Thousands of years earlier, according to conventional dating. This creates a contradiction that cannot be ignored. If Babylon possessed such systems, why do modern engineers consider themselves pioneers? Why is there no acknowledgement of ancient blueprints being rediscovered or skills may evolve, but they do not disappear entirely, leaving no trace, no memory, no written reference. Unless something else happened. And this is only the beginning. Because alongside pipes and power sources, there were lenses. Perfectly transparent glass plates, thick and uniform, with subtle curvature. When placed over fine inscriptions, they magnified text several times over. Simple magnifying lenses. But ancient glass, as displayed in museums, is cloudy. Full of bubbles. Uneven and brittle. Producing clear optical glass requires precise temperature control during melting and cooling. A difference of even a few degrees can ruin the entire piece. Yet these lenses were identical. Not similar. Not approximately the same. Identical in curvature, thickness, and optical behavior. This is factory-level precision. Standardized production. The work of people who understood refraction, focal length, and material consistency. And strangely, lenses of the same quality, shape, and purity appear again in Europe, dated to the 19th century. As if separated not by millennia, but by layers of earth. And with every new discovery, the same unsettling question grows louder: were these technologies truly ancient? Or are we standing on the remains of a civilization far more recent than we are told? This question will follow us deeper underground. And it will not let go. As excavations continued, the picture grew darker and more complex. In storage chambers beneath palaces and administrative buildings, archaeologists began uncovering metal tools that did not belong in the era they were assigned to. Saws with perfectly uniform teeth. Drills capable of producing deep, even holes. Cutters whose edges remained sharp despite having supposedly lain underground for thousands of years. Most unsettling of all was the metal itself. These tools had not rusted. Their surfaces still carried a metallic sheen, as though they had been sealed away only decades ago rather than millennia. Microscopic analysis revealed traces of mechanical processing on the tools themselves. Parallel lines left by rotating machinery. Marks consistent with lathes and milling devices operating at constant speed. The stone blocks these tools had shaped told the same story. Grooves cut into granite and limestone ran straight and deep, with identical width from start to finish. There was no variation in depth, no irregularity of force, no evidence of hand strikes. This was not the work of a copper chisel swung by human muscle. It was mechanical cutting. To achieve such results, a tool must be harder than the stone it cuts. It must rotate at high speed. It must maintain stable pressure and alignment. These are the requirements of powered machinery. And then there was the alloy itself. According to official history, stainless steel was invented in 1913 by the English metallurgist Harry Brayley. Before that moment, steel inevitably rusted. Iron oxidized rapidly, especially in humid environments. Countless attempts to create corrosion-resistant alloys had failed. Yet here, in museum cases labeled 2,000 years before our era, lay metal objects that defied corrosion entirely. Let us examine what stainless steel actually is. It is not simply iron with impurities. It requires chromium, typically between 12 and 20% of the alloy's mass. Less than that, and the protective oxide layer does not form. More than that, and the metal becomes brittle. Precision is essential. Chromium ore was first identified in Europe in 1797. Pure chromium was not successfully isolated until 1898. Smelting it requires extremely high temperatures and controlled conditions. To dissolve chromium evenly into molten iron, the furnace temperature must be maintained within a narrow range. Too low, and the metal separates. Too high, and the alloy is ruined. This demands thermometers or pyrometers, controlled furnaces, and a chemical understanding of metallurgy. And yet, objects matching these criteria sit in collections attributed to ancient Babylon. This is not an isolated anomaly. In Delhi stands an iron pillar over 7 meters tall, weighing more than 6 tons. It has stood in the open air for over 1,000 years, exposed to monsoon rains and humid heat, without significant corrosion. Analysis revealed an unusual composition, high phosphorus content, almost no sulfur, and a crystalline structure modern metallurgists struggle to reproduce consistently. In Peru, alloys have been discovered containing elements mixed in proportions that do not occur naturally, as if someone deliberately combined purified metals according to precise recipes. Across continents, the same pattern emerges. Identical alloys. Identical standards. Identical processing techniques. This suggests something far beyond local craftsmanship. It implies a network. A system of production and distribution operating on a global scale. As excavations pushed deeper underground, another type of structure began to appear. Small enclosed chambers, typically 5 by 7 meters in size, built with extraordinary acoustic precision. Along the walls stood tall ceramic vessels placed on special mounts, their openings angled toward a precise point in the center of the room. Some vessels were positioned higher, others lower. The distances between them were calculated down to the centimeter. At the center of the chamber, a small circular stone marked the exact standing position. When a person stood there and whispered, their voice was amplified many times over. The sound returned as a focused echo, clear and powerful, as though projected by an invisible speaker. Yet move away from the center, and the effect vanished. This was not random. The amplification was directional. Modern acoustics tells us that such behavior is produced by resonant systems tuned to specific frequencies. In this case, approximately 500 Hz, the range at which the human voice is most intelligible. In physics, these devices are known as Helmholtz resonators, named after the German scientist who formally described their principles in the 19th century. And yet, these chambers predate him by thousands of years, according to accepted timelines. Historians often suggest these rooms were built to make priests or judges sound more imposing. But the architecture raises another possibility. Corridors connect these chambers in deliberate patterns. Their placement suggests transmission rather than performance. A communication network. An acoustic system capable of relaying messages without wires, electricity, or visible mechanisms. Such systems require deep understanding of sound reflection, wave interference, material absorption, and resonance. Limestone reflects sound efficiently. Fabric absorbs it. The shape of each vessel determines its resonant frequency. This knowledge was not developed in Europe until the 17th century. And yet, dozens of identical chambers have been found across different sites. All constructed to the same specifications. All tuned to the same frequency. This was not trial and error. This was replication. Someone calculated these systems once, created precise designs, and reproduced them across an empire. Local builders did not experiment. They followed instructions. But there is more. Despite being underground, many of these halls show no trace of soot. The torches and oil lamps leave soot. It accumulates quickly. It stains stone permanently. Yet there is none. The official explanation suggests constant cleaning. But limestone is soft. Scrubbing it leaves scratches. Repeated cleaning would erode details. No such damage exists. There are no records of workers hired to clean ceilings daily. No disposal sites for tons of ash and soot. No economic documentation to support such an effort. The answer emerged elsewhere. In courtyard debris, archaeologists found bronze mirrors mounted on adjustable stands. Polished to a high shine, they still reflect clearly today. Hinges allowed precise adjustment of angle. By directing sunlight from open courtyards into corridors, and from mirror to mirror, daylight could be guided deep underground. A chain of reflections carried light where it should not naturally reach. This required precise understanding of optics. The angle of incidence equals the angle of reflection. Each reflection loses intensity, so mirror quality is critical. Surfaces must be smooth to avoid scattering. Such principles were formally codified during the European Renaissance. Yet here they were, applied on an architectural scale. And once you see this, you begin to notice it everywhere. Underground halls in European cathedrals from the 19th century show the same clean ceilings. The same absence of soot. The same reliance on reflected light rather than open flame. As if the same knowledge was applied across continents. The deeper we dig, the clearer the pattern becomes. These were not isolated achievements of clever ancient minds. They were components of a unified system. And the question is no longer whether these technologies existed. The question is who built them. And why they vanished. As the investigation moved from palaces to ordinary homes, the mystery deepened rather than faded. In residential districts once inhabited by merchants, officials, and skilled workers, archaeologists uncovered floor structures that defied expectations. These were not simple stone slabs laid on earth. The floors were double-layered. The lower layer rested on the ground. Above it, raised by roughly 30 centimeters, lay a second stone surface supported by short pillars and channels. Between these two layers was empty space. At first, the void seemed pointless. Then traces of soot were found not inside the living areas, but within external furnace chambers connected to the space beneath the floor. Hot air from these furnaces flowed through the underfloor cavity, circulating evenly before exiting through vents on the opposite side of the building. This was underfloor heating. Warm air never entered the living space directly. Smoke was diverted through separate chimneys. Heat radiated upward through the stone, creating a stable, comfortable environment. There was no soot, no smoke, no uneven heating. The entire floor became a source of warmth. Such a system cannot function by accident. For hot air to circulate correctly, precise draft calculations are required. If the channels are too narrow, the air stagnates. If too wide, the heat escapes too quickly. The height of the exhaust, the diameter of the ducts, and the placement of internal partitions must be calculated in advance. This is thermodynamics and fluid dynamics in action. Official history attributes such systems to the Romans, calling them hypocausts. Roman engineers were undoubtedly skilled. But here the problem emerges again. After the fall of Rome in the 5th century, this technology vanished. For over 1,000 years, Europeans lived in freezing stone castles heated by inefficient fireplaces. Smoke-filled halls. Heat escaped through roofs and walls. Common people survived winters in huts with open hearths, inhaling smoke and suffering from cold-related disease. Millions died prematurely. And yet, beneath their feet lay the remnants of heating systems capable of transforming daily life. There are no medieval chronicles describing attempts to restore underfloor heating. No records of engineers studying ancient remains to recreate the technology. No gradual rediscovery. It is as if the knowledge never existed at all. But the physical evidence says otherwise. Even more unsettling is the global distribution of this system. Variants appear in Korea, where similar heated floors are still used today. Comparable structures exist beneath ancient buildings in Eastern Europe and Russia. Across different climates and cultures, the same engineering logic appears. This suggests standardization. Underfloor heating requires mass-produced bricks of uniform size. Molds. Kilns. Quality control. An industrial approach, not isolated craftsmanship. Someone designed a universal standard of comfort. The story grows darker when we examine storage facilities. In underground warehouses, archaeologists uncovered hundreds of ceramic vessels coated with a distinctive greenish glaze. The ceramics were thick-walled, dense, and fired at extremely high temperatures. When one vessel was finally opened after years of careful excavation, its contents stunned researchers. Inside was vegetable oil. Golden in color. Clear. Free of mold. Free of rancid odor. It had not decomposed. Anyone who has left vegetable oil in a jar for a year knows what should happen. Oxidation causes it to spoil. Microorganisms flourish. Even sealed containers trap enough oxygen to trigger decay. To preserve oil for centuries, let alone millennia, extraordinary conditions are required. Either a near-perfect vacuum, chemical preservatives hostile to bacteria, or ceramic materials capable of releasing antibacterial compounds into the contents. Each option demands scientific understanding. This was not an isolated case. Thousands of such vessels have been found. In one warehouse alone, over 800 were discovered. All identical. All sealed with resin stoppers that expand as they harden, forming airtight seals. Many vessels bore markings indicating production batches or dates. This is industrial food preservation. A controlled process involving standardized recipes, firing temperatures, sealing techniques, and quality checks. Somewhere, there must have been laboratories testing materials, technologists refining formulas, and administrators tracking inventory. This is not ancient improvisation. It is systemized production. Nearby agricultural fields revealed another layer of automation. Irrigation channels contained self-regulating gates controlled by floats and counterweights. As water levels rose, cork floats lifted levers that opened sluices. When levels dropped, the gates closed automatically. No human intervention required. For such a mechanism to function reliably, the buoyancy of the float, the weight of the counterbalance, and the length of the lever arms must be calculated precisely. Even small errors cause failure. These systems were not unique prototypes. They appear repeatedly across different sites, built to the same design. Once again, we see an engineering standard disseminated across a wide territory. Consider one detail: the floats were made of cork. Cork oak grows primarily in the Mediterranean region. Its presence thousands of kilometers away implies large-scale trade networks. Transport of raw materials. Coordinated supply chains. Official chronology insists that such trade did not exist at this scale during the supposed era. Land routes were primitive. Sea navigation was limited. Yet the material evidence contradicts this. This was not a society of slaves with hoes, as often portrayed. This was a civilization that understood automation, efficiency, and labor optimization. Perhaps the most unsettling discovery lay beneath a ruined temple. A sealed chamber contained a bronze plate no larger than a human hand. Engraved upon it was a detailed map of the city. Streets, canals, buildings, and boundaries were depicted with astonishing accuracy. The scale was consistent. Angles were precise. Distances were proportional down to millimeters. Try to draw a modern neighborhood accurately by eye, without instruments, and errors quickly appear. Proportions drift. Lines curve. Angles distort. This map did not. To achieve such precision, either aerial surveying or geodetic triangulation is required. Measurements of angles and distances using specialized instruments. According to textbooks, triangulation was developed in the 16th century by European scientists. Earlier maps were schematic at best. And yet here was a map, dated 2,000 years before our era, more accurate than many 17th century European charts. This forces a choice. Either the dating is wrong, or history is. And as each discovery piles upon the last, one truth becomes unavoidable. These technologies did not emerge independently, disappear completely, and then reappear unchanged centuries later. They belong to a single, coherent system. A civilization that planned, calculated, standardized, and built on a scale that spanned continents. And if such a system existed, its disappearance cannot be explained by gradual decline. Something sudden must have happened. Something powerful enough to erase not only cities, but memory itself. If these technologies truly existed, the most disturbing question is not how they were built. It is why they disappeared. Human knowledge does not simply evaporate. Skills are taught from master to apprentice. Principles are recorded in drawings, instructions, and practice. Even after wars or collapses, fragments remain. People rebuild by remembering what once worked. History shows this clearly. After the fall of Rome, roads deteriorated but were still used. Latin fractured into new languages but did not vanish. Religious texts survived fires, invasions, and plagues. Knowledge bends, weakens, and transforms, but it does not reset to zero. And yet, with the technologies uncovered beneath Babylon and countless other cities, something different happened. Batteries ceased to exist and were rediscovered in 1800 by Alessandro Volta. Optical lenses vanished and reappeared in Europe in the 13th century as a revolutionary invention. Stainless steel disappeared entirely and was declared a breakthrough of 1913. Acoustic amplification systems were forgotten and reinvented during the 19th century. Precision metallurgy, industrial ceramics, automation, and standardized production all followed the same pattern. They appear. They vanish. They return, almost unchanged. This is not how natural progress works. There is no known example of humanity forgetting a fundamental physical phenomenon and later rediscovering it from scratch without continuity. Fire was never forgotten. The wheel was never erased from memory. Even when civilizations collapse, basic technologies survive because they are embedded in daily life. A lens magnifies light every time, in every era. A child who sees this once understands it forever. If lenses were widespread, their effect could not be unlearned. So where are the written records? Where are the Babylonian texts describing electrical elements? Where are the manuals explaining alloy compositions? Where are the diagrams of acoustic chambers, lighting mirrors, heating ducts, and irrigation automations? They are absent. Not incomplete. Absent. This absence is more disturbing than any artifact. Because it suggests that the people who used these technologies did not have the opportunity to preserve their knowledge. Or that someone ensured they would not. The pattern becomes clearer when examining excavation photographs from the 19th century. Workers stand beside grand stone buildings, not constructing them, but uncovering them. They pose with tools as if restoring or cleaning rather than building. The structures are already complete. Walls stand. Arches rise. Only the lower levels are buried. These images exist not only in the Middle East, but across Europe, Russia, and the Americas. Entire cities appear to have been partially submerged in earth. First floors buried. Windows transformed into basements. Doorways leading into soil. Streets raised meters above their original level. This is not the result of gradual sedimentation. This is the signature of a sudden event. A massive influx of mud, silt, and debris deposited in a short time. Geologists know this phenomenon. Mud flows, triggered by earthquakes, floods, or atmospheric disturbances, can bury cities within hours. When such events occur on a regional scale, the damage is catastrophic. When they occur globally, they rewrite civilization. The same buried architecture is found in St. Petersburg, Moscow, Berlin, Paris, Rome, and London. The same pattern appears in New York and Chicago. Buildings dated to different centuries share the same level of burial. History explains this away as cultural layers formed over long periods. But cultural layers do not seal windows, align across continents, and bury infrastructure uniformly. Catastrophes do. And this brings us to a name that has almost vanished from public discussion. Tat Arya. Open maps from the 17th and 18th centuries, and you will see it clearly. A vast territory stretching across Asia, occupying regions now divided into multiple modern states. The borders are consistent. The name appears on English, French, Dutch, and German maps alike. This was not a cartographic error. Independent mapmakers do not invent the same imaginary empire with the same boundaries. They document what exists. And then, something strange happens. By the middle of the 19th century, Tat Arya disappears from maps. Not gradually. Not through a documented series of wars. Not through treaties, revolutions, or famous conquests. It simply vanishes. Empires do not disappear quietly. Rome fell in stages, leaving endless records. The Mongol Empire fractured. There is no detailed historical account describing how half a continent was defeated. The silence is absolute. This suggests that Tat Arya was not conquered. It was erased. The same mud that buried Babylon buried cities across this vast territory. Infrastructure collapsed. Populations vanished or were displaced. Survivors, if any remained, lacked the means to preserve their history. And then came others. With shovels. With cameras. With printing presses. They uncovered cities that were not theirs. Technologies they did not build. Systems they did not understand. And they faced the same choice described at the beginning of this investigation. Admit that they were inheritors of ruins. Or rewrite history. They chose the second option. Chronology was stretched. A single era was fragmented into thousands of years. Identical technologies were assigned to different civilizations separated by time rather than connected by geography. Dating methods with wide margins of error were treated as absolute truth. Style replaced science. Anything that did not fit was locked away in museum storage, mislabeled, or quietly removed from view. Researchers who asked too many questions found doors closed. Archives delayed access. Maps cropped at convenient borders. Original documents restricted under vague justifications. Not because the truth was fragile, but because it was dangerous. If the world once functioned as a unified system, if energy, communication, comfort, and automation were freely available, then modern society is not the peak of progress. It is a reconstruction. A simplified imitation built atop the wreckage of something greater. And this leads to the most uncomfortable question of all. Who benefited from this reset? Was the catastrophe natural, or engineered? Was it an accident of climate and geology, or the result of forces that understood exactly what they were destroying? Who arrived after the dust settled, and why were they so eager to claim ownership of a world they did not build? These questions do not belong to mythology. They belong to history. And the deeper we look, the harder it becomes to accept the version we were taught. Because the evidence does not suggest a story of steady human advancement. It suggests cycles. Rises. Falls. Erasure. And rebuilding on stolen foundations. To understand how an entire civilization could be erased without leaving a clear trace, we must examine the most powerful tool used to control perception. Time. Not time as experienced, but time as assigned. History is not measured directly. It is inferred. Layers of soil, fragments of pottery, styles of ornamentation, and written references are interpreted and arranged into a timeline that feels solid, even when its foundations are fragile. Most people assume dates are fixed facts, calculated with scientific precision. In reality, much of ancient chronology rests on assumption. Consider the most frequently cited method, radiocarbon dating. It is often presented as definitive proof of age. Yet this method applies only to organic materials. Wood, bone, cloth, charcoal. It does not date stone, metal, ceramics, glass, or concrete. The vast majority of the technologies discussed so far fall entirely outside its reach. Even where radiocarbon dating can be applied, its margin of error is substantial. Hundreds of years are considered acceptable variance. Calibration depends on assumptions about atmospheric carbon levels in the past, assumptions that break down during periods of catastrophe, volcanic activity, or sudden climate shifts. A sample dated to 2000 years ago may, within error limits, belong to a period far closer to our own. But when radiocarbon is unavailable, another method takes over. Style. An object is dated by how it looks. By patterns, motifs, proportions, and decorative elements. If an artifact resembles others believed to belong to a certain era, it is assigned the same age. This is circular reasoning. An item is old because it looks old, and it looks old because similar items were previously declared old. Once a style is assigned to a period, everything matching it is pulled into the same timeline. But style can be copied. Style can persist. Style can be revived deliberately. Modern architects build in ancient styles all the time. Neoclassical buildings erected in the 19th century imitate Roman temples so convincingly that, without documentation, future archaeologists could easily misdate them by millennia. Now imagine a world recovering from catastrophe. Survivors inhabit ruined cities filled with monumental architecture they did not build. To repair and extend these structures, they copy what already exists. They reproduce the same styles because those are the only blueprints available. Suddenly, style becomes meaningless as a dating tool. Yet it is treated as decisive. This explains why ceramic fragments, metal objects, and architectural details are scattered across museums with dates that feel authoritative but rest on surprisingly little evidence. A label becomes truth. Once printed, it is rarely questioned. And when something contradicts the timeline, it is explained away. Too advanced? Ritual object. Too precise? Coincidence. Too similar across continents? Independent invention. These explanations are not conclusions. They are defenses. Now consider written sources. Most people assume that ancient history is supported by vast libraries of contemporary texts. In reality, the number of original documents from antiquity is astonishingly small. Many famous works survive only in copies made centuries later. Often, the originals are missing entirely. Who made the copies? Medieval monks, Renaissance scholars, early modern academics. The same people who benefited from a rewritten chronology. This does not require a global conspiracy. It requires something simpler. A narrative inherited and repeated until it becomes unquestionable. Errors propagate. Assumptions harden into doctrine. Now examine maps. Maps are among the most difficult historical objects to fake convincingly. They require accurate geographical knowledge, consistency across editions, and agreement among independent creators. Maps from the 17th and 18th centuries show Tartaria clearly. Not as a vague idea, but as a defined territory with borders, cities, and subdivisions. These maps were produced by cartographers from rival nations. They had no incentive to invent the same fiction. Yet modern reproductions often omit Tartaria entirely. Digitized versions are cropped. Labels are faded. Borders vanish beneath decorative frames. When original maps are requested for study, access is restricted. Delays stretch into years. Permissions are denied without explanation. This is not how buried cities do not align with gradual accumulation. Identical technologies across continents do not fit isolated development. Precision engineering does not emerge without infrastructure. And knowledge does not vanish globally without cause. The illusion of time is beginning to fail. If Babylon, Tartaria, and other so-called ancient cultures belong not to distant millennia but to a recent, forgotten era, then history as we know it collapses inward. The past becomes closer. The catastrophe more immediate. The loss more personal. We are not descendants separated by thousands of years. We are neighbors separated by silence. And once that silence is broken, the next question becomes unavoidable. If history was rewritten once, how many times has it been rewritten since? When photography first entered history, it was celebrated as an impartial witness. Unlike paintings or written accounts, photographs were believed to show reality exactly as it was. No interpretation. No exaggeration. Just evidence. And yet, when we examine some of the earliest photographs of cities around the world, they raise questions far more disturbing than any ancient artifact. Look closely at 19th century images from Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Men stand on scaffolding beside massive stone buildings. They pose with tools. They smile for the camera. Official captions describe these scenes as construction or early stages of development. But something feels wrong. The walls are already complete. Arches stand intact. Windows are framed. Columns are aligned with mathematical precision. These are not beginnings. They are finished structures. What is missing are the foundations. The lower floors are buried. Entrances sit below ground level. Windows open directly into soil. Streets appear unnaturally high compared to doorways. In many cases, entire ground floors are underground, reclassified as basements after excavation. This is not construction. This is uncovering. Across continents, the same pattern repeats. Cities that supposedly developed independently, at different times, show identical signs of burial. The depth is consistent. The materials are similar. The process of development looks more like cleaning, clearing, and repurposing than building. If these cities were constructed from scratch, where are the photographs of empty land? Where are the early wooden structures? Where are the gradual stages of growth? They are rare. Instead, we see monumental architecture appearing almost fully formed. Official history explains this by claiming rapid industrial progress. Steam power. New materials. Ambition. But even industrial construction leaves traces. Temporary supports. Incomplete walls. Piles of raw materials. These are largely absent. Instead, there is stone. Stone shaped with precision. Stone laid according to standards already perfected. This raises a dangerous possibility. What if the people in these photographs were not builders, but claimants? What if they were not creating cities, but inheriting them? After a catastrophe, cities buried under layers of mud would not vanish completely. Upper floors would remain accessible. Roofs and towers would protrude. Survivors or newcomers would clear entrances, remove debris, and adapt structures for use. From the outside, this would look like construction. From within, it would be appropriation. This theory explains another anomaly. Many 19th century buildings appear suddenly in historical records with no clear funding trail. No detailed architectural plans. No correspondence documenting design decisions. No engineering debates. Buildings of enormous complexity simply appear. railway stations, cathedrals, government halls, universities. Official narratives attribute them to visionary architects and national pride. But when original blueprints are examined, many are missing or suspiciously generic. Some plans do not match the final structure. Others are dated after construction supposedly began, as if documentation was created retroactively. This would make sense if the structures already existed. The same pattern applies to infrastructure. Bridges span rivers with elegant arches and precise load distribution. Tunnels cut through solid rock with smooth walls and consistent curvature. Sewer systems appear beneath cities before populations reach the scale that would require them. These are not incremental developments. They are remnants of a system designed for a different world. A world with different population densities, different energy availability, different priorities. And then there is the matter of uniformity. Architectural styles repeat globally. The same columns, the same domes, the same proportions, the same symbolic motifs. From Europe to Asia to the Americas, buildings follow a shared design language. Official explanations call this neoclassicism, a revival of ancient styles. But revival implies choice. Why would emerging nations across the world independently choose the same aesthetic at the same time? Why would they invest immense resources into stone monuments rather than cheaper, faster methods? Unless they were not choosing. Unless they were adapting what already stood. The catastrophe hypothesis explains the buried cities, the lack of soot in underground halls, the sudden appearance of advanced infrastructure, and the absence of transitional stages. It also explains why history needed to be rewritten. If newcomers openly admitted that cities predated them, questions would arise. Who built them? Where did the builders go? What technologies were lost? What else lies beneath our feet? These questions threaten legitimacy. So a narrative was constructed. The buildings were declared new. The technologies were rebranded as inventions. The timeline was stretched. The original creators were pushed into a mythical past, safely distant and safely inferior. Ancient enough not to challenge modern authority. This brings us back to Babylon. Babylon is presented as a ruin of deep antiquity, a symbol of humanity's early attempts at civilization. But its infrastructure tells a different story. Precision engineering. Standardized components. Systems integrated across architecture. These are not the experiments of a young civilization. They are the refinements of a mature one. And if Babylon belongs to this lost global system, then so do countless other ancient sites. Petra, Persepolis, Ankara, Teotihuacan, Machu Picchu. Each is treated as an isolated marvel. Each is dated to a different era. Yet all share the same fingerprints. Precision, standardization, integration, and burial. The deeper we look, the harder it becomes to believe that humanity slowly climbed from caves to skyscrapers. Consider the foundations. In so-called ancient cities, foundations are often massively overbuilt. Stone blocks weighing dozens or even hundreds of tons are laid with tolerances so tight that a blade cannot be inserted between them. This level of precision serves little purpose for primitive structures, yet it appears repeatedly beneath temples, palaces, and administrative buildings worldwide. Why would early societies invest such enormous effort into foundations alone? Because these buildings were not decorative. They were infrastructure. Many of these foundations contain cavities, channels, and shafts that are not explained by ceremonial use. Some are dismissed as ritual spaces. Others are called symbolic chambers. Yet their geometry is too regular, too functional, too consistent. Channels align with airflow. Cavities match acoustic resonance. Shafts follow gravitational logic for fluids or gases. These are engineering decisions. Above ground, the story continues. Columns follow strict ratios. The spacing between supports often corresponds to harmonic proportions found in physics and acoustics. Domes distribute loads in ways that modern engineers admire and study. Arches are shaped to minimize stress, not merely to impress. These are not aesthetic accidents. They are solutions refined through experience. Now look at the materials. Stone is chosen not randomly, but for specific properties. Granite where strength and vibration resistance are required. Limestone where sound reflection is desired. Basalt where durability against erosion matters. The same material logic appears in distant regions with no acknowledged technological connection. Official history claims independent invention. But independent invention produces diversity. Different cultures solve problems differently. What we see instead are identical answers. The same building language appears in places separated by oceans. This is not how human creativity behaves in isolation. This is how standardization looks. And standardization implies coordination. Take staircases. In monumental buildings across the world, stair dimensions are remarkably similar. Step height, step depth, incline angle. These are tuned to human ergonomics. Too steep and movement becomes exhausting. Too shallow and space is wasted. Modern building codes define these parameters carefully. Yet ancient staircases follow the same logic with surprising consistency. Who decided the standard? Who enforced it? Then there are windows. Large, arched windows appear in buildings long before glass is supposedly capable of filling them. Their proportions suggest they were designed for light transmission, not defense. Many are placed too low for fortifications and too large for climates where heat retention would be critical. Unless these buildings were not designed for the conditions we assume. Unless they belong to a world with different energy availability. A world where light could be guided, amplified, or distributed efficiently. Now consider the placement of cities themselves. Ancient cities are often located at points that make little sense for primitive societies. Hilltops without water sources. Flood-prone plains. Regions requiring advanced drainage and stabilization. Why build there? Because infrastructure already existed. Because the location was chosen long before, for reasons now forgotten. Because the systems beneath the surface made those locations viable. Once those systems failed, the cities became difficult to maintain. Floods increased. Soil destabilized. Foundations sank. Buildings were buried. New inhabitants inherited structures that no longer matched their environment. And so they struggled. They patched. They repurposed. They explained. They mythologized. This helps explain why so many ancient buildings appear unfinished or oddly modified. Windows bricked up. Passages sealed. Channels blocked. Upper floors inhabited while lower ones filled with earth. These are not original design flaws. They are adaptations. Adaptations by people who no longer understood the systems they lived within. Now look at the Americas. Civilizations like the Maya, Inca, and Aztec are portrayed as isolated developments. Yet their stonework matches old world techniques precisely. Polygonal masonry. Earthquake-resistant joints. Stone fitting without mortar. These techniques are rare. They require planning, precision, and experience. They appear suddenly, fully formed. And then disappear. The builders vanish. Later cultures reuse the structures but cannot replicate them. This is acknowledged quietly in academic circles, yet rarely emphasized publicly. Because it raises an uncomfortable question. How did knowledge travel so perfectly without leaving traces of travel? No ships. No ports. No records. Unless the knowledge did not travel. Unless it was already there. Unless all these regions were once part of the same system. A system that did not recognize continents as barriers. A system that operated on a planetary scale. This also explains why symbolic motifs repeat globally. The same geometric patterns. The same star shapes. The same use of circles, crosses, and grids. These are not cultural decorations. They are diagrams. Encoded knowledge. Maps of energy flow. Sound propagation. Structural balance. To later generations, they became symbols. Sacred art. Religious mystery. But originally, they were instructions. Once you see this, the idea of ancient religions transforms. What if temples were not houses of gods, but nodes? What if rituals were misunderstood operations? What if priests were not spiritual leaders, but technicians preserving fragments of lost knowledge through ceremony? This would explain why so many rituals involve sound, vibration, light, movement, and precise timing. Because those were the variables that mattered. And when understanding was lost, only repetition remained. The world did not begin in ignorance and climb toward intelligence. It may have begun with knowledge. And then forgotten it. What we call ancient history may not be the childhood of humanity. It may be its amnesia. When a civilization collapses, its machines do not vanish first. Understanding does. What remains are shapes, sounds, movements, and fragments of behavior repeated without knowing why they work. Over time, function becomes ritual. Engineering becomes ceremony. Instruction becomes myth. This transformation can be seen clearly when we examine what we now call ancient religion. Across the world, early religious practices share striking similarities. Chanting at specific pitches. Processions along fixed paths. Precise architectural orientation toward stars, solstices, or equinoxes. The use of resonant chambers, reflective surfaces, where water flow, heat circulation, and resonance were understood as parts of a unified system. When that system failed, its operators disappeared. Those who remained inherited only fragments. They knew the chart mattered, but not why. They knew the position was important, but not how it was calculated. They knew the ceremony worked, but not the mechanism. So they preserved the action. This is how religion is born. Look at sacred objects. Bells, gongs, tuning forks, horns, drums. These instruments appear in spiritual traditions worldwide. They are often tuned to specific frequencies. They are used to cleanse, open, or align. From a technical perspective, they generate vibration. Vibration affects matter. In modern laboratories, sound is used to move particles, shape materials, and influence chemical reactions. Ultrasound can clean metal, break stones, and even alter cellular behavior. But to a society that has lost its science, vibration becomes magic. Light follows the same pattern. Candles, mirrors, stained glass, polished metals. Sacred spaces are designed to glow. Light is directed, filtered, and concentrated. Certain moments of the year are chosen so that sunlight enters a temple at a precise angle, illuminating a specific point. Officially, this is symbolism. But symbolism does not require millimeter accuracy. Engineering does. Water is treated as sacred in almost every culture. Flowing water. Still water. Reflective pools. Channels beneath temples. Ritual washing. Controlled fountains. Water conducts vibration. It reflects light. It stabilizes temperature. It carries energy efficiently. To engineers, it is a medium. To priests without understanding, it is holy. Now consider the language of ancient myths. Gods descend from the sky. Fire comes from above. Weapons emit light. Voices thunder without mouths. Structures are raised by sound or command. Entire cities fall in a single moment, buried by earth and water. These are not fairy tales. They are descriptions filtered through ignorance. When technology exceeds understanding, it appears divine. If a global civilization collapsed suddenly, survivors would struggle to explain what destroyed it. They would lack vocabulary for atmospheric disturbances, electromagnetic phenomena, or engineered disasters. So they would describe what they saw. The sky darkened. The ground shook. A flood of earth swallowed cities. Fire fell from above. Sound familiar? These descriptions appear in myths from every continent. Different names. Same events. The Great Flood. The day the sun stood still. The War of the Gods. The Fall of Heaven. History labels these stories as symbolic. But symbolism does not bury cities. Something real happened. And the survivors encoded memory into story. Over generations, stories simplify. Details blur. Causes become characters. Mechanisms become personalities. Engineers become gods. By the time scholars record these myths, the original context is gone. What remains is religion. This explains why ancient religious authority often overlaps with technical knowledge. Priests controlled calendars, architecture, measurement, sound, and writing. They were keepers of timing, orientation, and repetition. They were not spiritual leaders first. They were system maintainers. When the system died, their role shifted. They guarded fragments, not because they understood them, but because tradition demanded preservation. Now consider why so many religious institutions resist questioning their origins. Because deep investigation threatens not belief, but legitimacy. If temples were once machines, then rituals are maintenance procedures without machines. If gods were once misunderstood operators or forces, then authority based on divine origin collapses. Religion becomes history. And history becomes theft. This is why official narratives insist on a clear separation between ancient belief and modern technology. The two must never meet. Their similarities must never be explored. Because the moment we recognize ritual as degraded technology, the timeline shatters. The ancient world was not ignorant. It was sophisticated. And we are not its children. We are its orphans. At some point, the system stopped working. Not gradually. Not region by region. But everywhere at once. When researchers compare destruction layers across continents, a troubling synchronization appears. Cities separated by oceans share the same scars. Foundations buried under meters of compacted soil. Streets filled, not with rubble from collapsing walls, but with fine sediment, clay, and silt, as if poured from above rather than accumulated over time. This is not erosion. This is deposition. Mud does not behave like sand or stone. It flows. It suffocates. It fills spaces completely, sealing doors, windows, and lower floors in a single movement. When mud hardens, it preserves what it buries, freezing architecture in place. This is exactly what we see. From Babylon to Rome, from St. Petersburg to Beijing, from Central America to South Asia, the same pattern repeats. Lower levels entombed. Upper structures exposed. Entire cities partially drowned in earth. Mainstream explanations struggle here. Cultural layers, we are told. Centuries of rebuilding, debris, and gradual accumulation. But cultural layers are irregular. They vary by neighborhood. They reflect human activity. They contain mixed materials. They do not form clean, horizontal seals across vast areas. Mudflows do. And mudflows on this scale require extraordinary conditions. A sudden influx of water mixed with fine sediment. Atmospheric instability. Massive precipitation events. Seismic activity. Or something far more violent. Geological records show evidence of abrupt climate anomalies in the recent past. Sudden temperature shifts. Rapid melting events. Unexplained sediment layers. Trees buried upright. Animals entombed mid-motion. These are not signs of slow change. They are signatures of catastrophe. Now connect this with history. The late 18th and early 19th centuries were marked by strange phenomena. The year without a summer in 1816 saw crops fail across Europe and North America. Skies darkened. Snow fell in June. Famine spread rapidly. Volcanic eruptions are blamed, yet the scale of disruption exceeded expectations. At the same time, cities worldwide underwent modernization, already embedded in ancient infrastructure. This explains why so many inventions of the modern era appear suddenly and fully formed. The knowledge was not created from nothing. It was extracted from ruins. Now ask yourself, if such a catastrophe occurred, who would survive? Those with access to high ground. Those with resources. Those with mobility. And who would disappear? Those living within the system itself. Those dependent on infrastructure. Those concentrated in cities. The builders. The operators. The technicians. Their disappearance explains the silence. No manuals. No continuity. No teachers. Only structures. Only fragments. Only myths. And into this vacuum stepped new authorities. They named the ruins. They dated them. They claimed them. They wrote histories that placed the builders safely in the distant past, beyond challenge. They declared themselves descendants, not usurpers. They framed catastrophe as antiquity. This was not necessarily malicious. It was necessary. A society cannot function while believing it lives in the shadow of something greater. Legitimacy demands superiority. The present must appear advanced, not diminished. So the past was made primitive. But the earth remembers. Mud does not lie. Buried cities tell a story of sudden interruption, not slow decline. Of a world that stopped, not one that evolved. And once you accept this, another question emerges. If the catastrophe was recent and global, then its cause matters. Was it natural? Or was it triggered? History avoids this question, because either answer is terrifying. If natural, then it can happen again. If engineered, then someone once had the power to end a world. And that power may still exist. If the destruction of a global civilization truly occurred, then the final piece of the puzzle is not technological, architectural, or geological. It is human. Catastrophes do not merely erase buildings. They erase people. And when people disappear suddenly, history fractures. What remains is not a smooth transition, but a silence so profound that later generations mistake it for ancient distance. The gap feels vast not because it lasted thousands of years, but because it severed continuity completely. When teachers vanish, knowledge does not slowly fade. It stops. Abruptly. And what follows is not progress, but improvisation. Consider what happens when a modern city loses power permanently. Within hours, systems fail. Within days, order collapses. Within weeks, knowledge becomes useless without infrastructure to support it. Now imagine this scenario multiplied across the entire planet. Energy grids shut down. Communication networks fall silent. Transportation systems become inert. Automated processes cease. Those who knew how to operate these systems are concentrated within them. When the system fails catastrophically, its operators are the most vulnerable. The survivors are not the engineers. They are those living on the margins. Rural populations. Nomads. Isolated communities. People with little reliance on complex infrastructure. They survive, but they do not inherit understanding. They inherit ruins. This explains a fundamental paradox. The world appears to regress, but not uniformly. Some knowledge survives in fragments. Language persists. Counting remains. Basic metallurgy continues. But higher-order systems vanish completely. Electricity. Precision optics. Acoustic engineering. Automation. These are not forgotten slowly. They are gone instantly. Because they depend on networks. On training. On documentation. On maintenance. Without continuity, they cannot be reinvented overnight. They become myths. And myths always fill the vacuum left by lost explanations. When people encounter structures they did not build, they explain them with stories. Giants. Gods. Demons. Divine architects. The builders become supernatural because no human memory remains to ground them in reality. This pattern repeats across cultures. Everywhere that monumental ruins exist, legends arise claiming non-human origin. This is not coincidence. It is psychological necessity. People cannot accept that their ancestors were more advanced than they are. It destabilizes identity. It undermines authority. So the builders are placed beyond humanity. Now look again at how history describes ancient populations. They are portrayed as primitive, superstitious, violent, and technologically limited. And yet, they are simultaneously credited with constructing wonders that modern engineers still struggle to explain. This contradiction is rarely addressed directly. Instead, it is softened with words like mysterious, enigmatic, or ahead of their time. But these phrases avoid the obvious conclusion. These people were not ahead of their time. They belonged to a different one. Once the catastrophe passed, the survivors faced an impossible task. They occupied cities they did not understand. Infrastructure surrounded them, but it no longer functioned. Heating systems lay buried. Light guides were blocked. Acoustic networks were silent. Energy sources were inert. To live inside these structures, survivors had to adapt them to simpler means. Fire replaced guided light. Hearths replaced underfloor heating. Smoke filled spaces once designed to be clean. Over time, soot accumulated. Walls blackened. Rooms were altered. Original functions were forgotten. This is why many ancient buildings appear internally modified. Fireplaces carved into stone that was never meant to hold open flame. Chimneys cut through structures that originally relied on draft systems. Windows sealed. Floors raised. Passages blocked. These are not design flaws. They are retrofits by people who no longer understood the original intent. And yet, even in adaptation, fragments of knowledge survived. People noticed that certain rooms carried sound better. That certain stones reflected voices. That certain spaces felt powerful. These observations became sacred. Over generations, function turned into belief. A chamber designed for acoustic transmission became a holy sanctuary. A light-guiding corridor became a divine passage. A resonance point became an altar. Ritual preserved behavior long after understanding vanished. This process explains why so many religions emphasize exact repetition. Exact words. Exact movements. Exact timing. The power was never in belief. It was in precision. And when precision was lost, repetition became the only safeguard. Change the ritual, and the effect vanished. So tradition hardened. Innovation became heresy. This question is avoided in mainstream discourse, not because it lacks evidence, but because both answers are unacceptable. A natural global mudflow implies planetary instability we cannot prevent. An engineered event implies technology capable of mass erasure. Either conclusion shatters the narrative of safety. Yet the evidence demands confrontation. Sudden burial. Global synchronization. Infrastructure failure. Population disappearance. Knowledge erasure. Historical rewriting. These are not random. They form a sequence. First, the system fails. Second, the cities are buried. Third, the builders vanish. Fourth, survivors adapt. Fifth, newcomers claim ownership. Sixth, history is rewritten. Every stage leaves a trace. And when these traces are aligned, a picture emerges that is impossible to ignore. The world we inhabit is not original. It is inherited. An inheritance without understanding breeds fear. Fear breeds control. Control breeds narrative. And narrative becomes history. This is why questioning chronology provokes hostility. Not debate. Hostility. Because time is not neutral. Time legitimizes power. Whoever controls the timeline controls authority. If the past is primitive, the present rules by default. If the past was superior, the present becomes a caretaker at best, an imposter at worst. This is why dating methods are defended so aggressively despite their limitations. Why margins of error are ignored when inconvenient. Why contradictory artifacts are hidden rather than studied. Because allowing uncertainty would open a door that cannot be closed. Once people realize that civilization can fall silently, without warning, without record, the illusion of permanence dissolves. Once people realize that history can be edited, trust collapses. And once people realize that progress is reversible, obedience weakens. This is the true reason these questions are discouraged. Not because they are wrong, but because they are destabilizing. Yet, the truth does not require belief. It requires observation. The earth has already recorded what happened. Beneath our cities lie answers. Beneath our feet rests a world that once functioned seamlessly. A world whose remnants we still use, still adapt, still misunderstand. We are not standing at the peak of history. We are standing on its debris. To understand what followed the catastrophe, we must stop imagining history as a clean sequence of events and start seeing it as a process of occupation. When a world collapses, it does not remain empty for long. Territory attracts claimants. Ruins invite ownership. Infrastructure, even damaged, is power. And power is never left unattended. Those who arrived after the mud settled did not encounter wilderness. They encountered cities without owners. Roads without guardians. Buildings without builders. Systems without operators. This was not discovery. It was succession without consent. These newcomers did not need to understand how the systems worked to benefit from them. They needed only to control access. A functioning aqueduct does not require knowledge of hydraulics to deliver water. A standing building does not require architectural mastery to provide shelter. A road does not demand engineering insight to allow movement. Control replaces comprehension. And control quickly becomes authority. This is where modern political structures begin to take shape. Not from innovation, but from administration. The earliest power centers of the post-catastrophe world are not workshops or laboratories. They are printing presses, academies, and legal institutions. Their function is not to build, but to define. To name. To categorize. To assign meaning. Whoever names the ruins owns the story. Whoever writes the first textbooks after silence sets the limits of memory. Chronology becomes the most powerful weapon. By stretching timelines, by fragmenting a single era into many, by isolating sites that share identical technologies and assigning them to different civilizations, continuity is destroyed. Once continuity is gone, comparison becomes impossible. Patterns vanish. Similarities become coincidence. What was once a network becomes a collection of myths. This is why identical technologies are never presented side by side in mainstream education. The Baghdad battery is treated as a curiosity. Acoustic chambers are framed as ceremonial oddities. Advanced metallurgy is labeled anomalous. Precision stonework is attributed to lost techniques or slave labor. Each case is isolated, contained, and neutralized. The moment these artifacts are viewed together, the illusion collapses. The people who inherited this world faced a dilemma. Admit that they were caretakers of something greater, or claim authorship. History shows which path was chosen. The ruins were rebranded as ancient. Their builders were pushed so far back in time that no connection could threaten modern legitimacy. Once enough centuries are placed between the present and the catastrophe, questions lose urgency. Curiosity fades into abstraction. The past becomes harmless. Education systems were structured accordingly. Children are taught that progress is linear. That knowledge accumulates steadily. That regression is temporary and local. Global collapse is unthinkable. Lost civilizations are framed as primitive failures rather than advanced successes undone by force. This narrative is comforting. It assures modern societies that they are superior by default. But comfort is not truth. Look at the language used to describe rediscovered technologies. Electricity is harnessed. Steam is unlocked. Light is understood. These words imply revelation, not creation. They suggest something already present, waiting to be noticed. And indeed, many early scientists explicitly described themselves as uncovering laws, not inventing them. The world already behaved according to these principles. The difference was observation. Now ask a deeper question. Why do so many foundational scientific breakthroughs occur within a narrow window of time? The 18th and 19th centuries explode with discovery. Mechanics, thermodynamics, electromagnetism, optics, chemistry. All appear rapidly, almost simultaneously. This is not how independent invention behaves. This is how reverse engineering behaves. When fragments of a lost system are studied collectively, understanding accelerates. Once a critical mass of recovered knowledge is reached, progress seems sudden. This period coincides precisely with large-scale excavation. Cities being modernized. Streets being lowered or raised. Old foundations exposed. Underground chambers cleared. This is not conspiracy in the theatrical sense. It is systemic preference. Technologies that reinforce control survive. Those that undermine it do not. The same logic applies to historical narrative. Empires are remembered when they validate modern borders. They are erased when they complicate them. Tartaria did not fit the emerging order. It was too large. Too recent. Too infrastructurally coherent. A single global system contradicts the idea of independent national progress. It undermines the legitimacy of conquest and division. So it disappeared. Maps changed. Borders hardened. Names were removed. What could not be erased was redefined. Tartaria became a vague term. A misunderstanding. A cartographic error. Its cities were reassigned to other histories. Its technologies fragmented. Its existence diluted. And yet, traces remain. In architecture. In soil. In artifacts. In patterns too consistent to ignore. This is why independent researchers, operating outside institutional pressure, keep reaching similar conclusions. Not because they share ideology, but because evidence converges. Buried cities. Reset timelines. Lost technologies. Global synchronization. These facts persist regardless of interpretation. What differs is courage. Because accepting this history changes everything. It reframes humanity not as a species slowly climbing toward enlightenment, but as one repeatedly reaching heights and being cut down. It suggests that progress is fragile. That memory is weaponized. That civilization is not guaranteed. And if that is true, then the future is not safe. If a global system once existed and was erased, it can happen again. Whether by nature or by design, the precedent is established. And those who control narrative today would rather you never consider that possibility. Awareness breeds resistance. Resistance threatens stability. So the past is softened. Simplified. Sanitized. But the earth does not cooperate. Every excavation reopens the wound. Every anomaly widens the crack. Every buried flaw whispers the same message. Something ended suddenly. And we live after it. The final question is not whether this lost civilization existed. The evidence already answers that. The question is whether we are willing to recognize ourselves honestly. Are we the inheritors of progress? Or the occupants of aftermath? Because if we are occupants, then our task is not celebration. It is responsibility. Responsibility to understand what was lost. Responsibility to recognize warning signs. Responsibility to protect what little continuity we have rebuilt. History does not repeat because humans forget dates. That it repeats because humans forget causes. And if the last reset was hidden beneath centuries of myth, the next one may not allow us the same luxury. In the end, the truth does not announce itself with certainty. It does not arrive as a declaration carved into stone or preserved in a single document. It emerges slowly, through patterns that refuse to disappear. Through questions that return no matter how firmly they are dismissed. Through evidence buried not in books, but beneath the ground itself. What was lost was not merely a civilization, but continuity. A break so complete that those who came after could not recognize what stood before them. Cities became ruins. Systems became myths. Knowledge became ritual. And over time, survival was mistaken for progress. This does not mean humanity failed. It means humanity endured. Survivors adapted. They reused what they did not understand. They lived inside structures they did not design. They told stories where explanations no longer existed. And from those stories, identities were built. Nations formed. Authority established. History written. But history, as we know it, is not a neutral record. It is a framework. And frameworks are constructed to support what stands upon them. Timelines legitimize power. Origins justify ownership. And forgetting becomes a tool as effective as remembering. The Earth itself tells a quieter, more honest story. Of sudden endings. Of buried worlds. Of advanced systems interrupted, not completed. Of a past that does not fit the narrative of linear ascent. These traces remain, not because they were meant to be found, but because erasure is never perfect. Whether the catastrophe was natural or engineered may never be answered with certainty. And perhaps that uncertainty is the most important lesson of all. Because it reminds us that civilization is not permanent. That complexity is fragile. That memory can be broken. What matters now is not proving superiority over those who came before us. It is recognizing vulnerability within ourselves. If a global system once existed and collapsed, then progress alone is not protection. Technology alone is not safety. Knowledge without humility is not wisdom. We stand today not at the beginning of history, and not at its peak, but somewhere in between, walking across the remains of something vast, powerful, and unfinished. Whether we repeat its fate depends not on what we build next, but on whether we choose to see clearly. Because the greatest danger is not forgetting the past. The greatest danger is believing it could never happen again.